the day the sun refused to move. Imagine standing on a battlefield thousands of years ago. The air is thick with dust. The sound of swords clashing echoes across rocky hills. Warriors shout. Shields collide. The outcome of the battle hangs in the balance. Above you, the sun is slowly descending toward the horizon. And that is a problem, because in the ancient world, daylight meant survival. When the sun set, battles often ended. Darkness brought confusion, fear, and the chance for enemies to escape. If the enemy survived the night, they could regroup, rebuild their forces, and attack again. Now imagine being the commander of an army in that exact moment. Your enemies are retreating. Victory is within reach. But the sun is going down. Time is running out. According to one of the most astonishing passages in the Bible, something happened at that moment that has puzzled readers for thousands of years. The commander lifted his voice and prayed. And then something impossible occurred. The sun stopped. The Bible describes this moment in the ancient text known as the Book of Joshua. The leader speaking was Joshua, the man who had taken command of Israel after the death of Moses. Joshua was leading the Israelites during a critical campaign in the land of Canaan. A powerful coalition of kings had formed an alliance against them. The fate of an entire region would be decided by the outcome of a single battle. As the story unfolds, Joshua cries out in the middle of the conflict with words that sound almost unbelievable. Sun, stand still over Gibeon. Moon, stop over the valley of Ajalon. According to the biblical narrative, that is exactly what happened. The sun stopped moving across the sky. The moon halted in its path. And daylight continued far longer than it should have. The text even emphasizes the strangeness of the event. It says there had never been a day like it before, and never one like it afterward. For centuries, readers have asked the same question. Did this actually happen? If it did, what could it possibly mean? From a scientific perspective, the idea raises enormous questions. Because when we say the sun stood still, we know something important about astronomy. The sun does not actually move across our sky. The apparent movement of the sun happens because the Earth rotates. If the sun truly stopped in the sky, it would mean the rotation of the Earth had somehow been altered, and that would have catastrophic consequences. The forces involved would be unimaginable. Oceans would surge across continents. Winds would sweep the planet at thousands of miles per hour. Cities would collapse. The entire world would experience devastation. Yet the biblical story describes something very different. Instead of global destruction, the extended daylight allowed one army to finish a battle. The event seemed local, focused, purposeful, which leads to another question. Did the ancient writer mean this literally? Or was something else happening? Over the centuries, scholars, historians, theologians, and scientists have proposed many explanations. Some believe it was a direct miracle, a moment when the normal laws of nature were temporarily suspended. Others believe the language is poetic. Ancient people often described astronomical events using dramatic expressions. Perhaps the writer meant the sun appeared to stop because of a rare atmospheric effect. Another theory suggests an astronomical event, such as an eclipse. Still others have explored the possibility that ancient records from other civilizations might describe an unusually long day around the same period in history. But the mystery remains, because the story is recorded in a very specific context: a battle, a prayer, and a day that seemed to last longer than any other. Whether one views it as history, legend, theology, or something in between, the account of the sun standing still has captured the imagination of people across cultures and centuries. It is one of the most dramatic moments in the entire Bible. And to understand why it mattered so much, we have to return to the beginning of that day. A day that began not with a miracle in the sky, but with a desperate call for help from a city under threat. That city was called Gibeon, and its decision would trigger one of the most extraordinary battles in ancient history. In the next part of this story, we will see how a political alliance, a broken treaty, and a midnight military march led Joshua and his army into a confrontation that would change the course of the entire region. A battle that would soon become famous not only for the clash of armies, but for the moment when the sun itself appeared to stop moving across the sky. The war that changed Israel's history. To understand why Joshua made such an extraordinary request, asking the sun to stop in the sky, we first need to understand the war that led to that moment. Because the event described in the book of Joshua did not happen in isolation. It happened in the middle of one of the most intense military campaigns in ancient history. The Israelites had recently entered the land of Canaan, a region filled with independent city-states, fortified towns, and powerful kings who ruled over their territories like small kingdoms. Each city controlled its own army. Each king defended his own land. And none of them were eager to see a new nation rise in their territory. For years, the Israelites had wandered through the wilderness under the leadership of Moses. But after Moses died, Joshua took command and began leading the people into the land they believed had been promised to them. Their arrival immediately began to change the balance of power. One by one, cities began to fall. The fortified city of Jericho had already been defeated in a dramatic event that stunned the surrounding region. Soon afterward, another strategic city, Ai, was also conquered. News spread quickly. Merchants, travelers, and refugees carried stories across the land. Stories of armies that seemed unstoppable. Stories of a people who believed their God fought alongside them. And stories of cities that had fallen in ways that seemed almost unbelievable. For the kings of Canaan, this was a terrifying development. But not every city responded the same way. One city chose a very different strategy. That city was Gibeon. The leaders of Gibeon understood something important. If they tried to fight the Israelites directly, they might suffer the same fate as Jericho and Ai. So instead of preparing for war, they chose deception. According to the biblical narrative, the people of Gibeon disguised themselves as travelers from a distant land. They wore worn-out clothes, carried cracked wineskins, and brought stale bread as evidence of a long journey. Then they approached Joshua and the Israelite leaders. Their message was simple. They claimed they had traveled from far away and wanted to make a peace treaty. Joshua and the leaders of Israel examined the evidence. The old clothes, the dry bread, the cracked wineskins. Everything seemed to confirm the story. But there was one critical mistake. The leaders did not seek guidance before making their decision. And so they agreed to a treaty. A promise of peace. A promise that the Gibeonites would not be attacked. Only later did the truth come out. The city of Gibeon was not far away at all. It was located only a short distance from the Israelite camp. The treaty had been secured through deception. The Israelites were angry when they discovered the truth. But they refused to break the oath they had made. Even though the treaty had been made under false pretenses, it was still a promise. And in the ancient world, breaking a sworn oath could have serious consequences. So the treaty remained in place. What the Gibeonites did not realize, however, was that their decision would soon place them in enormous danger. Because the other kings of the region were watching. And they were furious. One king in particular saw the treaty as a betrayal. His name was Adonizedek, the ruler of Jerusalem. Adonizedek understood the political implications of what had just happened. Gibeon was not a small village. It was a large and powerful city. Its warriors were known to be strong and capable fighters. If such a city had joined the Israelites instead of fighting them, it could shift the balance of power in the region. Other cities might follow the same path. And that could mean the end of Canaanite independence. So Adonizedek decided to act quickly. He sent messages to other kings across the southern region of Canaan. Kings who ruled cities such as Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon. His message was urgent. Gibeon had made peace with Israel, and that could not be allowed to stand. He called on the kings to unite their armies, not to attack Israel directly, but to punish Gibeon for its betrayal. Soon, a powerful alliance was formed. 5 kings, 5 armies, all marching toward one target, the city of Gibeon. Their plan was straightforward. Destroy Gibeon quickly. Send a clear message to any other city considering an alliance with Israel, and restore fear across the region. Meanwhile, inside Gibeon, the situation was becoming desperate. The city had chosen diplomacy over war. Now it faced the combined forces of 5 powerful kings. The leaders of Gibeon realized they had only one chance of survival. They needed help from the very people they had deceived. So they sent an urgent message to Joshua. The message traveled quickly across the hills and valleys of the region until it reached the Israelite camp at Gilgal. The words were direct and desperate. Do not abandon your servants. Come quickly. Save us. Help us. Because the armies of the 5 kings had already arrived. The battle was about to begin. And if Joshua did not act quickly, the city of Gibeon would be destroyed. Joshua now faced a difficult decision. The treaty with Gibeon had been obtained through deception. Yet it was still a binding promise. And if the Israelites ignored the call for help, their reputation and their word would be damaged. But marching to Gibeon would not be easy. The journey required traveling through steep terrain, and the enemy forces waiting there were enormous. 5 kings, 5 armies, thousands of warriors. Yet Joshua chose to act. Not slowly, not cautiously, but immediately. What followed next was one of the most daring military maneuvers recorded in the ancient world. Joshua gathered his army, and under the cover of night, they began a long and exhausting march across the rugged landscape toward Gibeon. By the time dawn arrived, the battle that would lead to the most mysterious day in biblical history was about to begin. A battle that would soon push Joshua to make one of the most astonishing prayers ever recorded. A prayer that would ask the sun itself to stop moving in the sky. The night march of Joshua. When the desperate message from Gibeon finally reached the Israelite camp at Gilgal, the situation was already critical. 5 kings had joined forces. 5 armies were moving toward the city. And once their siege began, Gibeon would have little chance of surviving. The leaders of the city knew it. The messengers who delivered the plea for help knew it. And Joshua understood it immediately. But what made the moment even more complicated was the history between Israel and Gibeon. The treaty that bound them together had been formed through deception. The Gibeonites had tricked Joshua and the leaders of Israel into believing they were travelers from a distant land. Only later did the truth emerge, that their city was actually nearby. Yet despite the deception, the agreement had been sworn as an oath. In the ancient world, an oath was not something that could be casually ignored. To break a sworn promise would damage a nation's reputation and invite distrust from every other group in the region. So Joshua faced a choice: ignore the request and allow Gibeon to be destroyed, or honor the treaty and march into a battle against a coalition of 5 kings. The decision did not take long. According to the book of Joshua, Joshua chose to act immediately. But the plan he chose was not simply to march toward the enemy. Instead, he chose a strategy that relied on speed, surprise, and endurance. The army would march through the night. From Gilgal to Gibeon, the journey was not easy. The distance was roughly 20 miles. But the greater challenge was the terrain. The route climbed from the Jordan Valley up into the hill country of Canaan. The elevation rose dramatically, and the path wound through rocky slopes and narrow passes. For soldiers carrying weapons and armor, it would be exhausting. Yet Joshua pushed his army forward. Hour after hour, through darkness and uneven ground, the Israelite warriors marched. Torches flickered in the night. Boots struck against stone. Armor rattled quietly with each step. No battle cries. No horns. No noise that might reveal their approach. The entire movement was meant to remain hidden. Meanwhile, far ahead of them, the coalition armies of the 5 kings were already surrounding Gibeon. These kings had every reason to feel confident. Their alliance was powerful. Their numbers were large. And they believed the Israelites were still far away at Gilgal. From their perspective, the destruction of Gibeon was only a matter of time. The city walls were strong, but 5 armies could eventually overwhelm them. Inside the city, the people of Gibeon likely spent the night in fear. They had gambled their survival on an alliance with Israel. Now they waited to see whether Joshua would honor the treaty. And while they waited, something extraordinary was happening beyond the hills. Joshua's army was moving closer with every passing hour. The march continued through the darkest hours of the night. Fatigue must have spread through the ranks. Muscles aching, breath heavy, but the soldiers kept moving. Because surprise was their greatest weapon. If they arrived before the enemy expected them, they could strike suddenly and disrupt the entire coalition. At last, the first light of dawn began to appear on the horizon. The long night march was nearly over. Ahead of them lay the hills around Gibeon, and beyond those hills stood the armies of 5 kings. When Joshua's forces finally arrived, the moment of surprise must have been overwhelming. The coalition armies were not expecting an attack at dawn. They believed they had time to prepare their siege. Instead, they suddenly faced an enemy army appearing almost out of nowhere. The book of Joshua describes the moment in simple but powerful terms. The enemy was thrown into confusion. Panic spread through their ranks. What had been a confident alliance suddenly became a chaotic battlefield. The Israelites charged into battle. Swords clashed. Warriors shouted. Dust rose into the morning air as thousands of soldiers fought across the rocky terrain. The coalition forces began to retreat. Their formation broke apart. What had started as an organized alliance turned into a desperate attempt to escape. The battle surged across the hills surrounding Gibeon. Some soldiers fled south. Others tried to regroup along the roads leading toward the valleys. Joshua's army pursued them relentlessly. This was not just another skirmish. This battle could determine control of the entire region. If the 5 kings were defeated, the power structure of southern Canaan would collapse. And so the Israelites pressed forward. The enemy forces fled along the road descending toward the valley of Ajalon. But even as the battle turned in Joshua's favor, a new problem began to appear. The sun was climbing across the sky. Hours of fighting had passed. The coalition armies were still retreating. Yet the battlefield stretched across a wide area of hills and valleys. If night fell too soon, many of the enemy soldiers would escape. Darkness would provide cover. The defeated kings could regroup. New alliances could form. And the war might begin all over again. Joshua could see the problem clearly. Victory was within reach. But the day was slipping away. The sun continued its slow movement toward the horizon. Every minute mattered. Every hour of daylight meant another chance to pursue the fleeing armies. And in that moment, standing in the middle of a battlefield, watching the sun move across the sky, Joshua made a decision unlike any other recorded in ancient history. Instead of accepting the limits of time, he spoke a prayer that sounded impossible, a prayer directed not only toward heaven, but toward the sky itself. Soon, according to the biblical account, something happened that would leave generations of readers wondering whether the laws of nature themselves had briefly paused. The sun above Gibeon would appear to stop moving, and the day would continue far longer than anyone expected. The day the sun stood still, the battle had already lasted for hours. Across the rugged hills near Gibeon, thousands of soldiers clashed in a desperate struggle that would determine the future of the region. The coalition of kings that had once marched confidently toward Gibeon was now retreating in chaos. What began as a siege had become a rout. The armies of the 5 kings were fleeing, and the forces led by Joshua were pursuing them across the hills and valleys of southern Canaan. But as the fighting continued, Joshua faced a growing problem. Time. Battles in the ancient world were often limited by daylight. When darkness fell, armies lost visibility, communication became difficult, and soldiers could easily become separated from their units. Nightfall often meant the end of the fight. If the enemy escaped into the darkness, they could regroup, gather reinforcements, and return to the battlefield another day. Joshua understood this very well. The coalition armies were already breaking apart and running. If his forces had more time, they could finish the battle completely. But the sun was moving steadily across the sky. The afternoon light was fading, and the longer the battle continued, the closer nightfall came. The enemy soldiers were fleeing toward the slopes that led down to the valley of Ajalon, trying to escape the pursuing Israelites. Some historians imagine the scene unfolding across miles of rugged terrain. Groups of soldiers running through narrow mountain roads. Warriors scrambling down rocky slopes. Dust clouds rising behind them. Meanwhile, the Israelite army continued to press forward, trying to prevent the enemy from reorganizing. It was during this moment, according to the account in the book of Joshua, that something extraordinary happened. Joshua looked toward the sky. The sun still hung above the hills near Gibeon, but it was moving, slowly descending toward the horizon. If daylight ended too soon, the battle might end unfinished. So Joshua did something that would echo through history. He spoke a command, not to his soldiers, not to the enemy, but to the sky itself. The ancient text records his words with striking simplicity. Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon, stop over the valley of Ajalon. The request was astonishing. Joshua was not merely asking for victory. He was asking for time itself to pause, for the sun to stop moving across the sky, for the moon to remain fixed in its place. And according to the biblical narrative, that is exactly what happened. The book of Joshua continues with a statement that has fascinated readers for centuries. It says the sun stopped in the middle of the sky, and it delayed going down for about a full day. The text emphasizes how unusual this event was. It states that there had never been a day like it before, nor one like it afterward, a day when the sun seemed to stand still. For the soldiers on the battlefield, the experience must have been extraordinary. Instead of watching the afternoon fade into evening, they saw the light remain. The sun held its position in the sky, Shadows stretched across the hills, but did not grow longer. The daylight continued, hour after hour. Meanwhile, the fleeing armies had nowhere to hide. Without the cover of darkness, the coalition forces continued to scatter. The Israelites pursued them relentlessly across the valleys and roads leading away from Gibeon. The biblical account describes another dramatic moment during this pursuit. As the enemy forces fled downhill toward Beth Horon, a sudden storm erupted. Large hailstones began falling from the sky. These were not ordinary pieces of ice. The text describes them as massive stones of hail that struck the fleeing soldiers. And according to the account, more enemy warriors died from the hail than from the swords of the Israelites. The battlefield had become something far beyond a normal military encounter. Natural forces themselves seemed to be part of the conflict. The extended daylight, the sudden storm, the relentless pursuit. The 5 kings who had formed the coalition soon realized the disaster that was unfolding. Their armies were collapsing. Their soldiers were scattering across the landscape. The alliance that once seemed so powerful had been shattered in a single day. Eventually, the kings themselves abandoned the battlefield and fled. They hid in a cave near Makeda, hoping to escape the chaos and survive. But the battle itself had already been decided. With the daylight continuing far longer than expected, Joshua's forces were able to pursue the enemy across the region. By the time the sun finally set, the coalition armies had been completely defeated. The victory changed everything. The power of the southern Canaanite kings had been broken. Cities that once stood confidently against Israel now faced a new reality. And at the center of the story remained the event that had made the victory possible. The moment when Joshua spoke to the sky, and the sun appeared to stop. For thousands of years, readers have returned to this passage with the same sense of wonder. What exactly happened that day? Did the sun literally stop moving? Or did something else occur that ancient observers described using the language available to them? Today we understand something about the movement of the heavens that ancient people did not fully grasp. The sun does not move across the sky. It is the earth that rotates. So if the sun appeared to stand still, it would imply something remarkable about the movement of the earth itself. But if the earth truly stopped rotating, even briefly, the consequences would be catastrophic. Oceans would surge across continents. Winds would tear across the planet with unimaginable force. The entire world would experience devastation. Yet the biblical account describes a localized event centered around a battlefield. This contradiction has led many scholars to explore different interpretations of the story. Some believe the event was a direct miracle, a moment when the normal order of nature was temporarily altered. Others believe the language of the passage reflects poetic expression. Ancient writers often described astronomical events using vivid imagery. Still others believe the story might refer to an unusual atmospheric phenomenon or celestial event that created the illusion of extended daylight. But regardless of the explanation, the story of the sun standing still has remained one of the most intriguing passages in the Bible, because it combines history, faith, and mystery in a single dramatic moment. A moment when a commander standing on a battlefield asked for more time. And according to the ancient account, time itself seemed to pause. What would happen if the sun actually stopped? The story recorded in the book of Joshua is one of the most extraordinary descriptions of a natural event in all of ancient literature. Joshua stands in the middle of a battlefield. Armies are fleeing. Victory is close. But daylight is fading. So he prays, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon. Moon, stop over the valley of Ajalon." And according to the text, the sun stops moving across the sky. For readers in the ancient world, this statement may have sounded astonishing, but not necessarily impossible. People in those times described the movement of the sun as something that literally crossed the sky each day. But today we understand something important about how the heavens actually move. The sun does not travel across our sky. The earth rotates. Our planet spins on its axis once every 24 hours, creating the cycle of day and night. As the earth turns, the sun appears to rise in the east and set in the west. So if the sun truly stood still in the sky, something dramatic would have had to happen to the earth itself. Its rotation would need to stop, or at least slow down dramatically. And that possibility raises enormous scientific questions. Because stopping the rotation of a planet is not a small event. It would be a global catastrophe. To understand why, imagine what would happen if the Earth suddenly stopped spinning. At the equator, The Earth's surface moves at roughly 1,000 miles per hour due to rotation. Everything on the planet, oceans, atmosphere, cities, forests, mountains, is moving along with that rotation. If the Earth suddenly stopped, all of that motion would continue forward due to inertia. The results would be devastating. Oceans would surge across continents. Gigantic waves would crash into coastlines and sweep far inland. The atmosphere would continue moving, creating winds that could exceed thousands of miles per hour. Anything not anchored deeply into the ground could be thrown across the landscape. Cities would collapse. Mountainsides would crumble. Entire ecosystems would be destroyed. Even the Earth's crust might experience massive earthquakes as the planet's rotation abruptly changed. In other words, if the Earth literally stopped spinning for an extended period of time, the entire planet would experience unimaginable destruction. But the story in the book of Joshua describes something very different. Instead of worldwide catastrophe, the narrative focuses on a battlefield. The extended daylight benefits one army during a pursuit. No mention is made of global disasters. No record of oceans flooding the continents. No account of worldwide destruction. This raises an important question. If the sun appeared to stand still, but the Earth did not actually stop rotating, what could have caused such an observation? Over the centuries, scholars have explored many different possibilities. One explanation is that the event was a direct miracle. From this perspective, the laws of nature themselves were temporarily altered. The event would not need to follow normal physical rules because it was an act of divine intervention. For those who read the story from a theological perspective, this interpretation fits naturally within the larger narrative of the Bible, where other miraculous events are also described. But many historians and scientists have also attempted to explore natural explanations that might help explain the story. One possibility is that the ancient writer was describing the event using poetic or symbolic language. Ancient Hebrew literature often used vivid imagery to describe events. The phrase "the sun stood still" might have been a way of expressing that daylight lasted much longer than expected. Another idea involves atmospheric phenomena. Under certain rare conditions, the bending of light in the atmosphere can create unusual visual effects. Refraction can sometimes make the sun appear higher in the sky than it actually is. This effect is most commonly seen near sunrise or sunset, when the sun appears slightly lifted above the horizon due to the bending of light. If a rare atmospheric condition extended daylight visibility longer than normal, observers might describe the sun as remaining in the sky. However, this explanation would likely account for only a relatively short extension of daylight, perhaps minutes, not hours. Another possibility involves unusual weather conditions. The biblical account itself describes something dramatic happening in the sky during the battle. As the enemy armies fled, large hailstones began falling. The storm was powerful enough that more soldiers reportedly died from the hail than from the swords of the Israelites. This detail suggests the battlefield was already experiencing extraordinary weather. Some researchers have suggested that a combination of storm clouds, shifting light conditions, and atmospheric effects could have created the impression of prolonged daylight. Yet there is another theory that has received attention in recent years. Some scholars have proposed that the event described in the book of Joshua might actually refer to an astronomical event, specifically a solar eclipse. A solar eclipse occurs when the moon passes directly between the Earth and the sun, temporarily blocking the sunlight. Ancient observers sometimes described eclipses using dramatic language because they were rare and frightening events. However, this explanation also raises problems. An eclipse causes darkness during the day. It does not make the day longer. In fact, it briefly makes the sky darker. So if the biblical passage describes extended daylight, an eclipse alone cannot fully explain the event. Interestingly, the original Hebrew wording in the text has been studied carefully by linguists. Some scholars argue that the phrase translated as "stand still" might also carry the meaning of "be silent" or "stop shining." This interpretation could potentially align with the idea of a solar eclipse. But even that interpretation remains debated among experts. Another possibility is that the story reflects an ancient poetic tradition embedded within the narrative. The passage itself mentions something called the Book of Jasher, an ancient source that may have contained poetic songs or historical accounts. If the description of the sun standing still originally came from a poetic source, It may have used symbolic language to celebrate a military victory. Yet even if poetic elements exist, the passage still describes a remarkable day that stood out in memory. The text specifically says there had never been a day like it before or since. That statement suggests the event was perceived as extraordinary even by ancient standards. Which brings us back to the central mystery. Something unusual happened during the battle near Gibeon. Something dramatic enough that it became part of the historical memory of an entire people. Was it a miracle? An atmospheric phenomenon? A poetic description of an unusual battle? Or something else entirely? In the next part of our exploration, we will look beyond the Bible itself and ask another fascinating question. Are there any other ancient cultures that recorded a day that seemed unusually long? Because if such an event truly occurred, it might not have been witnessed by only one group of people. And somewhere in the records of ancient civilizations, there might be clues that help us understand whether the day the sun stood still was remembered in more than one place. Ancient records of a strange day. If something extraordinary truly happened on the day described in the book of Joshua, it raises a fascinating possibility. Could anyone else have seen it? Because if the sun truly appeared to stop, or if daylight somehow lasted far longer than normal, it would not have been visible only to the army of Joshua. The sky belongs to the whole world. Any unusual astronomical event would potentially be observed across many regions of the Earth. That idea has inspired historians and researchers to search ancient records from other civilizations for descriptions of strange days. Days when the sun behaved differently than expected. Over the centuries, several intriguing stories have surfaced. Some researchers point to ancient traditions from Asia. Certain early Chinese historical writings describe unusual celestial events, including days when the sun's behavior seemed abnormal. Ancient Chinese astronomers were among the most careful sky watchers in the ancient world, recording eclipses, comets, and planetary movements with remarkable accuracy. However, none of the surviving records clearly describe a day when the sun literally stopped moving. Other traditions come from ancient cultures in the Americas. Some oral legends passed down through generations speak about unusually long days or nights. In certain Mesoamerican traditions, stories tell of a time when daylight lasted longer than expected, allowing warriors to finish battles before darkness arrived. But these stories are difficult to verify historically. Many were transmitted orally for centuries before being written down, and they often blend mythology with historical memory. Another often mentioned source comes from ancient Mediterranean writings. Some researchers have suggested that Greek historians may have preserved echoes of unusual astronomical events in their works. For example, the Greek historian Herodotus recorded traditions describing changes in the movement of celestial bodies. In one passage, he mentioned Egyptian priests who claimed the sun had changed its path several times in the distant past. However, these statements were part of a much broader historical narrative and do not directly describe a single day when the sun stopped. Because of this, most historians treat such accounts cautiously. Ancient cultures often use symbolic language when discussing the heavens. Stories about the sun reversing course or remaining in the sky longer than usual might have represented mythological explanations for unusual natural phenomena. Yet the search for parallels continues. Some modern researchers have proposed that unusual astronomical events, such as rare planetary alignments, meteor impacts, or atmospheric disturbances, might leave impressions in the traditions of multiple civilizations. But so far, no definitive global record has been discovered that clearly matches the biblical description. That does not necessarily mean the event never occurred. Ancient historical records are incomplete. Entire libraries of ancient writings have been lost over time due to war, natural disasters, and the slow decay of fragile materials like papyrus and parchment. For example, the famous Library of Alexandria once contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls from across the ancient world. Many of those texts disappeared when the library was destroyed in a series of fires and conflicts. If other cultures once recorded unusual astronomical events similar to the one described in the book of Joshua, those records might simply no longer exist. Another important detail is that ancient observers did not always describe events in scientific terms. Instead, they often interpreted celestial phenomena through the lens of religion or mythology. A strange event in the sky might be described as a god intervening in human affairs. A comet might be seen as an omen. An eclipse might be interpreted as a cosmic battle between divine forces. Because of this, even if another culture observed the same phenomenon, their description might look very different from the biblical account. Yet the biblical narrative itself contains an intriguing clue. When the story describes the sun standing still, it references another ancient source. It says the event was recorded in something called the Book of Jasher. This mysterious book is mentioned only a few times in the Bible, and no complete copy has survived to the present day. Many scholars believe it may have been a collection of historical poems or songs celebrating important events in Israel's history. If the account of the sun standing still originally came from a poetic source, it might have been part of a song describing the victory at Gibeon. In ancient poetry, dramatic language was often used to emphasize the significance of an event. The sun stopping in the sky could symbolize the idea that time itself seemed to pause while the battle reached its conclusion. But even if poetic elements are present, the memory of the event must have been powerful. The narrative preserved in the book of Joshua treats the day as something extraordinary, something so unusual that the writer emphasizes there had never been another day like it. And that statement raises an interesting possibility. Perhaps the most important part of the story is not whether the sun literally stopped moving. Perhaps the significance lies in how the event was experienced by those who lived through it. Imagine being one of the soldiers on that battlefield. The fighting has lasted for hours. Your enemies are fleeing across the hills. The light of the sun remains in the sky longer than expected. A powerful storm begins to unleash hailstones that strike the retreating army. Every moment of daylight gives you another chance to pursue the enemy, another chance to secure victory. From the perspective of someone standing on that battlefield, it might truly feel as though time itself had slowed, as though the day refused to end, as though the sun was remaining in the sky far longer than it should. Whether the explanation lies in miracle, natural phenomenon, poetic expression, or some combination of all three, the story of the sun standing still remains one of the most fascinating mysteries in ancient literature. It stands at the intersection of history, faith, and science. And even today, thousands of years later, it continues to raise new questions. In the next part of our exploration, we will examine one of the most widely discussed scientific explanations for the event. Some researchers believe the description in the Book of Joshua might actually be connected to a specific astronomical event, one that scientists have attempted to calculate using modern data. Could an eclipse or other celestial alignment explain what ancient observers described? Or does the mystery remain unsolved? Could an eclipse explain the story? For centuries, the account of the sun standing still in the Book of Joshua has fascinated historians, theologians, and scientists alike. Many readers have wondered whether the event described by Joshua might correspond to a real astronomical phenomenon. Among the most widely discussed possibilities is the idea of a solar eclipse. A solar eclipse occurs when the moon passes directly between the Earth and the sun, temporarily blocking sunlight from reaching the surface of the planet. When this alignment happens perfectly, the moon casts a shadow on the Earth, and for a brief moment, daylight fades into an eerie twilight. In ancient times, such events were terrifying. Without modern scientific knowledge, people could not predict when eclipses would occur. When the sun suddenly darkened in the middle of the day, many believed it was a sign from the heavens, an omen, a warning, or a divine intervention. Because of this, eclipses were often recorded in historical documents across many ancient civilizations. Chinese astronomers carefully documented them. Babylonian sky watchers tracked their cycles. Greek scholars attempted to understand their patterns. So it is natural for modern researchers to ask whether the event described in the Book of Joshua might actually be an ancient description of an eclipse. Interestingly, some scholars have suggested that the Hebrew wording in the passage could support this possibility. The phrase, often translated as "stand still," might also carry a slightly different meaning depending on context. Some linguists note that the word can imply "be silent," "cease," or "stop shining." If interpreted that way, the command spoken by Joshua might be read differently. "Sun, stop shining over Gibeon." Such language could potentially describe the sudden darkening of the sky during an eclipse. This interpretation gained renewed attention in recent years when researchers attempted to match biblical descriptions with known astronomical events. Using modern computer models, scientists can calculate the timing of ancient eclipses thousands of years into the past. By analyzing orbital patterns of the Earth and Moon, astronomers can determine when eclipses would have been visible from specific locations. One study suggested that a solar eclipse occurred in the region of Canaan around the late 13th century BC, roughly the period some scholars associate with the events described in the Book of Joshua. This finding sparked excitement among researchers interested in biblical chronology. If the passage referred to an eclipse, it might help anchor the story to a specific historical moment. However, the eclipse explanation also faces several challenges. The most obvious problem is that an eclipse does not make the day longer. In fact, it briefly makes the sky darker. During a total solar eclipse, the sun disappears behind the moon for only a few minutes. Even the longest total eclipses last less than 8 minutes before the sun begins to reappear. After that, daylight quickly returns to normal. But the biblical account describes something very different. It suggests the sun remained in the sky for an unusually long period of time. The text even emphasizes that the day was extended, allowing Joshua's forces to complete their pursuit of the enemy. This description does not match the typical effects of an eclipse. Instead of shortening daylight, the story describes the opposite. Another difficulty lies in the mention of both the sun and the moon. Joshua's command refers to the sun over Gibeon and the moon over the valley of Ajalon. During a solar eclipse, the moon is directly between the earth and the sun. But observers would not normally see the moon in a separate position across the sky during that event. This detail suggests the passage may not be describing an eclipse in the modern scientific sense. Still, the discussion highlights something important. Ancient people were paying attention to the sky. They watched the movements of the sun, moon, and stars closely. These celestial patterns shaped agricultural cycles, religious festivals, and the measurement of time itself. When something unusual happened in the sky, it captured attention immediately, and those events often found their way into historical records. Even today, astronomers study ancient descriptions of celestial events because they can help refine modern models of planetary motion. By comparing historical observations with modern calculations, scientists can improve our understanding of how the Earth's rotation has changed over long periods of time. For example, the gravitational pull of the moon gradually slows the Earth's rotation over millions of years. This means the length of a day very slowly increases over time. Ancient eclipse records help scientists measure these subtle changes. But when it comes to the day the sun stood still, the available evidence remains inconclusive. No single astronomical explanation fully accounts for the biblical description. The eclipse theory is intriguing, but incomplete. Other explanations, such as atmospheric effects, poetic language, or miraculous intervention, continue to be discussed as well. And perhaps that is part of what makes the story so compelling. It exists at the boundary between science and faith, history and mystery. A battlefield, a prayer, a sky that seemed to behave in a way no one had ever seen before. As we reach the final part of this exploration, one question still remains. What does this story ultimately mean? Whether understood as a literal miracle, an unusual natural event, or a powerful piece of ancient storytelling, the day the sun stood still has endured for thousands of years. In the conclusion, we will reflect on why this moment in the Book of Joshua continues to fascinate people today, and why the mystery of that extraordinary day may never fully be solved. What happened after the longest day? By the time the extraordinary day described in the Book of Joshua was finally coming to an end, the battlefield had completely changed. What had begun as a powerful alliance of kings marching confidently toward Gibeon had turned into a chaotic retreat across the hills and valleys of southern Canaan. The armies of the coalition were scattered. The soldiers who once stood together in formation were now fleeing in every direction, and the forces led by Joshua continued pursuing them relentlessly. The extended daylight, whether miraculous, natural, or perceived, had given Joshua something that ancient commanders rarely received in battle. Time. Time to pursue the fleeing armies. Time to prevent them from regrouping. Time to turn a battlefield victory into a decisive military collapse. As the pursuit continued, news soon reached Joshua that the 5 kings who had led the alliance were still alive. Instead of fighting to the end, they had abandoned their armies and fled. Their escape did not take them far. The kings had hidden themselves in a cave near the city of Makeda. When Joshua learned of their location, he gave a practical order. Large stones were rolled in front of the cave entrance, sealing the kings inside, while the Israelite army continued pursuing the remaining enemy forces. The priority was clear. The battle had to be finished first. Only after the pursuit ended would Joshua return to deal with the leaders who had started the war. Meanwhile, the defeated armies continued retreating across the countryside. Some soldiers fled toward nearby fortified cities. Others disappeared into the hills. But without organized leadership, the alliance had effectively collapsed. The power of the 5 kings was broken. Eventually, when the pursuit had accomplished its purpose, Joshua returned to the cave at Makeda. The entrance was opened. The 5 kings were brought out and presented before the Israelite army. In the ancient world, battles between kingdoms were not only about territory, they were also about authority and power. The defeat of a king symbolized the defeat of his entire nation. According to the account in the book of Joshua, Joshua gathered his commanders and called them forward. He instructed them to place their feet on the necks of the defeated kings. To modern readers, this moment may seem harsh. But in the context of ancient warfare, the gesture carried a clear symbolic meaning. It represented complete victory. The power of the opposing rulers had been broken. Afterward, the kings were executed, and their bodies were displayed briefly before being placed back inside the cave. The entrance was sealed again with large stones, marking the place where the leaders of the defeated alliance had fallen. With the kings gone and their armies scattered, the political structure of southern Canaan began to shift rapidly. Cities that once trusted the strength of the coalition now realized that the alliance had failed. Without their rulers, many of these cities soon faced attacks from Joshua's forces. The campaign continued through the region, one city after another. From Makeda, Joshua moved on to other cities, including Lachish, Eglon, and Hebron. Each victory further weakened the remaining resistance in the south. Within a relatively short period of time, the entire balance of power in the region had changed. And at the center of that turning point stood one extraordinary day. A day when the battle that began near Gibeon did not end at sunset. A day when the pursuit continued far longer than anyone expected. A day remembered because of a prayer spoken in the middle of a battlefield. For the people who recorded the story, the event carried enormous significance. It was not simply a military victory. It was seen as evidence that their God had intervened in history. The book of Joshua emphasizes this idea repeatedly. The text states that the victory occurred because the Lord fought for Israel. The hailstorm that struck the enemy, the confusion that spread through their ranks, and the extraordinary extension of daylight. All of these events were interpreted as part of the same divine intervention. Whether one interprets the story as literal history, theological narrative, or a blend of both, the impact of the event on Israel's early history was profound. The defeat of the 5 kings opened the door for further campaigns throughout the land. Without their powerful alliance, the remaining city-states were far more vulnerable. And the memory of the day the sun stood still became part of the cultural identity of the people who preserved the story. For generations, the event was retold, not merely as a strange astronomical occurrence, but as a moment when heaven itself seemed to respond to a prayer. A moment when the normal rhythm of day and night appeared to pause. And as the years passed, the story spread beyond the battlefield where it began. It became one of the most dramatic moments in the entire biblical narrative. A moment that continues to raise questions thousands of years later. Did the sun truly stop in the sky? Did time itself pause? Or did ancient observers experience an event so unusual that the only way to describe it was to say the sun stood still? The answer may never be known with certainty, but the story itself has endured, because it captures something deeply human. A moment when someone facing impossible odds looked toward the sky and asked for just a little more time. Did time really stop that day? For thousands of years, the story of the day the sun stood still has fascinated readers, historians, scientists, and believers alike. It is one of the most unusual passages in the entire book of Joshua. A battlefield, a desperate moment, a prayer spoken under the open sky. And then, according to the ancient account, something happened that seemed to defy the normal rhythm of the universe. The sun stopped moving. The day continued, and an army finished a battle that might otherwise have slipped into darkness. But what actually happened that day? That question has been asked for centuries. Some people read the story and see a miracle. From this perspective, the explanation is simple. The God who created the universe also has authority over it. If the creator of the cosmos chose to extend a single day in human history, then the laws of nature could simply be suspended for that moment. In this view, the event is not meant to be explained by physics. It is meant to demonstrate divine power. For believers throughout history, the story has served as a reminder that the natural world is not beyond the reach of divine intervention. Yet other readers approach the story differently. Historians and scientists often search for natural explanations behind ancient accounts. When they examine the description in the book of Joshua, they look for clues that might point to a real astronomical or atmospheric event. Could it have been an eclipse? An unusual atmospheric refraction? A rare weather phenomenon that created the illusion of prolonged daylight? Or perhaps a poetic description of a battle that simply seemed to last forever? These questions remain open. Ancient texts often combine history, memory, and symbolism. The writers who recorded these events did not use the language of modern science. Instead, they described the world using the imagery and understanding available to them. When the sun appeared to remain in the sky longer than expected, the most natural way to describe the experience might have been to say that the sun had stopped. And even today, we still use similar language. We say the sun rises. We say the sun sets. Even though we know that it is actually the earth rotating beneath the sky. Language often reflects how things appear to us rather than how they physically function. Yet there is another reason the story has remained so powerful. It is not only about astronomy. It is about a moment of human desperation. On that battlefield near Gibeon, Joshua faced a challenge that commanders throughout history have known all too well. Victory was close, but time was running out. And in that moment, instead of accepting the limits of the situation, he asked for more time. That simple idea resonates across centuries, because everyone understands what it feels like to wish for just a little more time. More time to finish a task, more time to solve a problem, more time to achieve a goal that seems just within reach. In the story, Joshua does something remarkable. He asks the impossible. And according to the ancient account, the impossible seems to happen. The day continues. The battle is finished. The enemy is defeated. Whether one interprets the story as a literal miracle, a poetic description of an extraordinary battle, or a historical memory shaped by generations of retelling, the narrative captures a moment when the ordinary flow of time seemed to pause. And perhaps that is why the story has endured for so long. It invites us to imagine a world where the boundaries of time and nature are not always fixed. A world where the sky itself might respond to a human voice. Even today, thousands of years after the battle near Gibeon, the question remains. Did the sun really stand still? Did the earth pause in its rotation? Or did ancient witnesses experience an event so unusual that the only way to describe it was through the language of miracle? The answer may never be fully known, but the mystery continues to spark curiosity, debate, and wonder. Because sometimes the most fascinating stories in history are the ones that sit right on the edge between science and faith, between what we can explain and what we can only imagine. And somewhere in the distant past, on a battlefield beneath the open sky, there was a day that people remembered differently from every other day. A day when the sun seemed to refuse to move. A day when the light stayed just a little longer. A day when time itself appeared to wait.